my grandmother's quote about the Depression. She had four small boys, and her quote was that a pound of bacon was only a dime. The problem was no one had a dime. And that's the way she tried to describe how it was. Could you talk a little bit about the legacy of the Soil Conservation Service and explain what the program, Hugh Bennett's role in establishing it, and what you see as its long-term legacy?
Again, a great question. When the United States set out to try to fix the Dust Bowl, which in itself is somewhat hubristic and preposterous, the idea that you think, well, we destroyed this piece of nature, now we're going to act like God and we're going to restore it. So it's somewhat arrogant on its basis to even think you could fix what you just horribly screwed up. But they did want to fix it. Most of the country was behind them. But this often happens in our history. As it went on, the people outside of the Dust Bowl turned against the folks here. And so you saw support in Congress gradually go down. At the same time, you saw people say terrible things about people here. They called them Okies, and it was almost a racist term. And they'd said, those people are rubes, they're stupid, they ruin the land. I saw an editorial where they said, why don't we just send them all our junk cars and that'll hold the land down. They really were turning against them. Roosevelt did not. Those of you who've read my book know that it ends with Franklin Roosevelt in Amarillo. 100,000 people turning out in, as it turned out, a huge rainstorm, a gully washer, to see FDR, and holding the biggest flag. They said, now this is subject to Texas exaggeration, but the biggest flag ever stitched together and the biggest assembly, biggest band ever assembled. But there were 100,000 people in the streets of Amarillo to greet Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt never gave up, and he said, and that's why he won Texas by about 75% of the vote, won Oklahoma by about 75% of the vote. Sides have switched. He thought he could fix the area. What ultimately came of it, the lasting legacy, was the Soil Conservation Service. Now, that happened at a time, right? That's why I talked about the Congress was so tired of this. They weren't willing to help this area anymore. They said, the South needs money. The Pacific Northwest is getting money for hydro. The Midwest was still suffering. California was suffering. Everybody wanted a little bit of relief money. 1 in 4 Americans was without a job. So, this is one of these great quirks of history. On the day that the Congress was considering approval of the Soil Conservation Service was day 5 after Black Sunday. So the storm that had come rolling down the midsection of the United States had taken a turn and moved along the coast and moved up to, of all places, Washington, D.C. And Franklin Roosevelt remembers going like this on his desk in the White House and finding a little bit of Amarillo dirt on that desk. And Hugh Bennett was trying to convince, I tell this story, it's from Bennett's biography. He exaggerated a little bit, but it's mostly true. He was trying to convince reluctant Congress to set up the Soil Conservation Service. And he knew the storm was coming up to Washington, because they have reports it's coming. And Abe would whisper in his ear, just keep BSing him, Hugh, just keep telling stories. Bennett was a great storyteller. He'd tell some more stories. And then finally they say, it's only a half hour away. So he'd go away. So finally it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon and it turns dark. Not midnight dark like it did here, but dark enough, like Good Friday dark. And Bennett goes, there, gentlemen, there. That's what I'm talking about. And everyone looks out the window and he goes, there goes the state of Oklahoma. And it was a convincing enough illustration, call it biblical if you will, to convince a reluctant Congress to sign a bill creating the Soil Conservation Service. Roosevelt signed it that day, and it became, as I said, outside of Social Security, the lasting legacy of the New Deal. Now, what did it do? Well, it wasn't necessarily top down. It was bottom up. It encouraged people across this land, and that's why they still do it to this day, to look at the land as an environmental, ecological whole. It's not just your square mile versus Jed's square mile versus Henry's square mile, but say, we're all in this together. If I can't keep, I may do good things on my land, but if you don't keep your land down, it's going to blow on top of mine. In fact, farmers often said, you son of a bitch, I've got half of your dirt on top of my land right now. You know, so they encourage people to look at it as an ecological whole, to form these districts. The second thing it did, and this was crucial, and it seems obvious now, but a lot of things that seem obvious now are only obvious after someone comes up with them. They tilled the soil differently. The soil conservation crews got people to go and do different types of tilling, to till so the wind would come down in these furrows. Instead of hitting it head on and send it to the sky, it would come down, the prevailing winds would go with the tilling lines. Rest the land as well. Instead of hammering it every year and putting a crop in every year, you let it rest for a year or two. So all these things came down. So that people say, what saved the Dust Bowl? Well, nothing really. I mean, if you look at the entire area, it was 100 million acres, an area the size of state of Pennsylvania that was basically destroyed. That's a huge piece of prairie grass that was peeled off and thrown to the sky, wrong side up, as that Apache cowboy said. Of the 100 million acres, 16 million became the national grasslands. That's still a very small part of it. Probably about 20 million of it went back into agriculture through the Soil Conservation Service and has been able to produce again. But the rest of it, the majority of it, is gone. Is basically, you can see the legacy of it all around. I mean, it's oil and gas, it's other things right now, but it's certainly not being farmed, and it certainly doesn't have grass on it.
Do you think that the key, as much as the Conservation Service, was a weather pattern change that begins roughly in 1937? And how did that play out over the years?
Well, we have a historical lesson in that, because in the 1950s, another killer drought came through this region. Most of you probably remember it. And as I said, the winds were always blowing. It wasn't like anything had changed. A drought came through, and there were dusters. There are pictures of those 1950s dusters. I don't want to underestimate them. There were some good-sized storms, but it was nothing like what happened in the 1930s. So it showed you that some things had changed, that the land was better in place, that farming practices were somewhat better. But yeah, weather patterns did have a big deal. But I don't blame the weather for the Dust Bowl. I really don't. Again, because you can look at these as, this is what the scientists do. They find a slice of a tree from a draw on the prairie somewhere, you know, cottonwood or something that's been around forever, and you can look at it, and they can go back almost 1,000 years by looking at a tree slices. And they can see by looking at those tree slices, there were some terrible droughts long before there were any Anglos living here. Probably long before the Comanche or the Apache were roaming around too, because as you know, they're relatively recent. But they can see these terrible drought periods, and it didn't destroy the area. So droughts cycles come and go, and you're right, 1937, that long drought finally ended and people got some rain, coinciding with Roosevelt's visit to Amarillo. So he sort of took credit for it. I mean, an inch of rain fell on him in the half hour that he was giving his speech. His glasses got drenched. I mean, it's great to look at the footage from that event. By the way, has the president visited Amarillo since?
Yeah.
I hope so, yeah.
Eisenhower.
Eisenhower came? Good, okay.
In a drought situation.
We gotta come in a non-drought year, you know? See the prairie at its best. So yes, there have been terrible droughts in the past. So I don't think it was the ending of the dry season that ended the Dust Bowl.
Well, thank you very much, Timothy. It's been great to have you here. I have been signaled that we are almost out of time. He is on his way up to Amarillo for some activities up there, and tonight at the Globe News Center, Civic Center. Thank you. Is it the Heritage Room? Yes, the Heritage Room.
Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
I want to make sure you all see the Ken Burns film. And the airing date she mentioned was wrong. It's November 18th, actually. It'll be over 2 nights. And it is beautiful. Now, I have a bias in it because I helped Ken and I participated in it and I'm on camera. But it's an amazing film. It's 4 hours. You know, Ken did Civil War, baseball, jazz. And here's why I want to encourage you. I tell this story. When my kid was taking his high school American history class, AP history, and he brought home this fat history book. and I was researching this book. I was so immersed in the Dust Bowl. I was thinking, dreaming, sleeping, talking, boring all my friends. I went to the back of this history book. There's only one paragraph on the Dust Bowl. So most Americans had forgotten about it. It was not even being taught in the schools, and it ticked me off. Now, 30 to 40 million Americans, hopefully a bigger audience, will see this story on November 18th and 19th, so I want to give a plug for that. Sorry.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Please spend the rest of the day at the museum. You can come back anytime you want. Thank you.